Nobody private. It's West Virginia.
Thank you.
I think we're ready to start, everybody. Welcome, Huntersville. I think we're ready to start. We've got a speaker here tonight. His name's Michael Woods. He's from Marshall University, and we're just tickled to death to have everybody. Glad to have the Poconos Historical Society represented here tonight. And so he'll make a little talk, and then we'll ask some questions later.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. He's left-handed shaker.
Yeah. And I wish I had a good story for how I heard it, but I was actually cleaning the carpet, so be careful when you do that. A big thank you to Tim and for everybody for being here and for putting this invitation together for me. I am a relative newcomer to West Virginia. I moved here from South Carolina 2 years ago to teach at Marshall, so thank you for being so welcoming. I want to talk to you about West Virginia, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and to make some connections between the place and the event that are usually thought of separately. You usually think about the assassination of Lincoln in national terms or as a kind of a slice of the history of Washington, D.C. And then what I want to do is connect the assassination both to some specific West Virginians who played prominent roles, especially in the aftermath of the assassination, and then to talk about what the effect of the assassination was on a state that was born during the war, was born deeply divided out of the war, and I would suggest that the assassination of Lincoln made rebuilding people's lives and communities much more difficult after the war within West Virginia than it otherwise would have been. That's kind of the big picture here. But I want to start with a story. I want to start in Barboursville, West Virginia, very close to my home in Huntington. This is probably the only talk on the Lincoln assassination you will ever hear that starts in Barboursville, West Virginia. And I want to start with a fellow named William Dusenberry. Dusenberry was a miller by trade. He was a unionist in his politics, so he had supported the creation of West Virginia, supported the Union during the war. He's a resident of Cabell County. And he woke up on April 15th, 1865, to a day that he would never forget. When he woke up that morning, he was actually in a very festive mood. He was still celebrating Lee's surrender on April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse. And he could look forward to a future very soon where the war would come to an end, the Union would be reunited, and West Virginians would be able to get back on their feet with statehood. At 10 o'clock that morning, on the morning of April 15th, a steamship docked at Guyandotte along the Ohio River, adjacent to Barboursville. And the ship brought some very painful news. President Abraham Lincoln had been shot the previous night, and at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, he died. Now, initially, people often refused to believe this report. There had been all kinds of rumors circulating about how the war was going, about what might happen as the war was coming to an end. So a lot of people didn't believe it at first. But Dusenberry suspected the worst. His instincts told him that something was true about this. And the thought of even just the possibility of Lincoln's death hit him very hard. He wrote in his diary, and we have this diary at Marshall University, which is how I know I have some insight into what he's thinking. He wrote that day, "I felt that it was true and could not do anything the rest of the day." And part of the reason for that is that for him, the loss of Lincoln could never come at a good time. But what made it especially bad was the fact that it comes right after a series of Union victories. The capture of Richmond on April 3rd, Lee's surrender on April 9th. So what we have is a series of victories that he has been celebrating, that he has been really relishing, and then the news of Lincoln's death hits him. Punch in the stomach. And he said, "The news of Lincoln's death coming over us, just as we were celebrating our glorious victories, caused the very senses of all loyal men to pause. Intense gloom pervaded all the loyal citizens' countenances. Cold rain fell that night, and it matched perfectly Dusenberry's mood. Dusenberry seems to have slept late when he was depressed. He had trouble getting out of bed the next morning. But when he did get out of bed, he went into town. What he found was that the effects of the assassination had already begun to reach Barboursville, even though it seemed so distant from Washington, D.C. And it revealed some of the divisions within the town. The local secessionist made some remarks applauding the assassination, and he had provoked an attack by a squad of Union soldiers who actually beat him up and drove him out of town, wouldn't let him come back. Dusenberry noted that other rebel sympathizers, as he put it, kept out of sight all day. This was not a good time to be saying anything good about the Confederacy, about its President Jefferson Davis, or about the assassin John Wilkes Booth. And what this suggests right away is that reconciliation after the war was a long way off. The violence in Barbersville had a way of kind of foreshadowing mountaineers' struggle to rebuild a state that had been deeply divided and to rebuild individual communities that had been deeply divided by the war and now were polarized by the assassination. So I want to explore this at two different levels. In the first part of the rest of the talk, I want to talk some about the role of West Virginians within the assassination. So I'll give you a kind of a relatively standard account of the assassination. Some of it may be familiar to you, some of it may not. But I'm going to highlight three people, and you've got their pictures there, who you may not have heard about, who have ties to West Virginia. Then in the second part, I'll zoom in on the state, and we'll look at how people dealt with, or sometimes didn't deal with, the effects of the assassination. So we'll start with a little bit of background on what actually happened in April 1865. Abraham Lincoln's life was in danger from the moment that he was elected president in November 1860. Most famously, his victory triggered secession, the secession of an eventual total of 11 states. But there were already people plotting, even before he was sworn into office, there were already people planning to kill him right away. And they tended to write in letters. Over the course of his presidency, Lincoln received a tremendous amount of mail. And some of the notes were friendly, trying to warn him about the possibility of an assassination. Other notes were not so friendly. One of them read, "Damn you, every breath you take." Another one said that the correspondent was part of a group of 10 men who had plotted to shoot Lincoln during his March 4th inaugural procession. Why they would tip him off is hard to say, but they wanted to send a threat. Other threats were a little bit more bizarre. One correspondent threatened to put, quote, "a spider in your dumpling," but Lincoln did not resign. Now, I looked into that, and in the question and answer, if you're curious about what that might mean, remind me of it. Well, I'll talk about that. The bottom line is that Lincoln continued to receive these kinds of threats throughout his presidency, but he never refused, or he never took them as seriously as a lot of his friends did, and a lot of his friends wanted him to. According to a staff member, Lincoln actually kept all of these threatening letters in a file folder in his desk labeled Assassination. He would simply add letters to the file and tuck it away in the drawer. Sometimes he had 80 or 90 letters in there at a time. Lincoln sometimes made jokes about the assassination. He often liked to kind of deflect these kinds of serious topics with a joke or a story. Other times, he tended to be very fatalistic about it. He tended to say, if someone is really willing to trade his life for mine, to assassinate me, then there's really nothing I can do to stop it from happening. Only rarely did Lincoln take any specific steps to avoid very clear conspiracies against his life. The most famous of these is actually during his train trip to Washington before he's sworn in. He reschedules the stop so that he passes through Baltimore, where a very clear conspiracy had been found ahead of schedule, so that he could avoid that. And had he not done so, he might well have been killed. Later in 1862, while the war was going, Lincoln very reluctantly agreed to allow a company of Pennsylvania cavalrymen to escort him around. He would ride on horseback or take carriage rides in Washington. He never liked having these soldiers following him around. He very frequently raced off ahead of them to be away from them. This was tough duty for them to keep up with them. And he liked to sneak away on his own even after a sniper shot at him and almost hit him while he was riding alone in August of 1862. So he spends a lot of time traveling alone against the advice of those who are assigned to protect him. And these habits of riding and traveling alone attracted the notice of Confederate sympathizers who are numerous in the Washington, D.C. area. And what they noticed, especially, is that Lincoln is particularly vulnerable when he rides to and from the Soldiers' Home, which is a federally owned property about 3 miles north of the White House that Lincoln used as a kind of a summertime retreat. Washington was very hot, and very unhealthy in the 1860s, and so Lincoln would spend some of his summer days at the Soldiers' Home. He went to and from it by himself, and this attracted the notice of a Confederate officer who was living in Maryland at that time. He was recovering from a wound that he had received in action. He observed Lincoln's tendency to travel alone, and after he recovered, he went back to Richmond, the Confederate capital. He got an interview with the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who happened to be the cousin of Davis's first wife, so he had a kind of connection with the Confederate president. And what he offered was to lead a band of men to kidnap Lincoln on the way between the Soldiers' Home and the White House, bring him back to Richmond as a prisoner, and use him as a kind of a bargaining chip. Maybe use Lincoln to exchange for Confederate prisoners of war, or to have some other kind of leverage over the Union. At that point, Davis refused to authorize the mission, but the same plan kept coming up again and again in very high levels of the Confederate government, the Confederate Secret Service. Several other times, other officers and other Confederate Secret Service agents dabbled with the idea of kidnapping Lincoln and bringing him back to Confederate territory. We don't know exactly how or when John Wilkes Booth became involved in these plots to capture Lincoln, but we know that by August of 1864, he too was thinking about the same plan. He was considering a plan to kidnap Lincoln en route between the White House and the Soldiers' Home and bring him to Richmond. Now, in some ways, Booth was really ideal for this kind of a mission. He was a die-hard Confederate. He had a lot of like-minded friends in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland. But he also could travel freely across Union territory. During the war, he spent time in New York, in St. Louis, in Washington. He went to Montreal in Canada, where he met with Confederate Secret Service agents there. So he travels widely. He knows people. He's got a winning charm. Of course, he's known as one of the great actors of his day, so people know who he is. He's also still a relatively young man. He's only 27 years old in 1865, or he would turn 27 that year. So he's got the kind of background that makes him ideally suited for the mission. He also has a lot of contacts with Confederate agents in southeastern Maryland. He has been cultivating friendships with them over the course of the war, getting to know who they are, whose homes he might be able to stop at. This will be really important if he does kidnap Lincoln, because he's going to need their help to get Lincoln out of the capital and back to Richmond. So Booth isn't really working alone here. He's not a lone gunman. He's not a lunatic. He's working very closely with Confederate agents who are working to smuggle supplies in and out of Virginia. Booth is committed to Confederate independence. He's committed to white supremacy. He regards Lincoln as an enemy of both. And he considered his activities to be acts of war. And in some ways, for him, that war had begun long before 1861. He had gone when John Brown was captured after leading his failed attempt to start a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry. Booth is there on the scene to watch Brown die when he's hanged. And Booth, at that point, seems to have committed himself to doing something equally grand. He actually has a lot of respect for Brown. Politically, he hates him, but he has respect for his personal courage. And Booth is already starting to think about doing something like that himself. And of course, he would commit one of the war's final violent acts in 1865. Now, we don't know exactly when he changed his mind from kidnapping to assassination. As late as March 27th, 1865, Booth still seems to be planning to abduct Lincoln, but by mid-April, we know that he has switched plans and that his mind had turned to murdering the president. There's a couple different reasons why this might have been. One is that with the surrender of Lee's army on April 9th, Booth may not have seen much strategic value in bringing Lincoln back alive. He might not be worth more alive than dead because the war is going so badly. Booth may also have been influenced by Lincoln's evolving policy on Reconstruction, and specifically on voting rights for former slaves. Booth was on hand when Lincoln spoke at the White House on April 11th. Lincoln appears at a second-story window. There's a crowd, mostly of Unionists, below. Lincoln wants to celebrate Lee's surrender, but he also is turning his thoughts to the future and thinking about what the South will look like after the war. Lincoln, in this speech, pointed to the state of Louisiana. as a model that he believed that other Confederate states should follow. Unionists within Louisiana had written a new state constitution, they had abolished slavery, and now they were actually debating whether to extend the franchise to black men within their state. On April 11th, Lincoln agreed with this. He's very cautious, he's very, very wary about saying too much, but on that day he becomes the first U.S. president to endorse black suffrage. And this is one more step in the wrong direction as far as Booth is concerned. We know that he turned to his co-conspirator, Lewis Powell, who's standing there listening to the speech with Lincoln, and he whispers in his ear, he said, "This means nigger citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That'll be the last speech he'll ever make." And as it turned out, Booth was right. 3 days later, on Good Friday, April 14th, Booth learned that Lincoln was going to attend a play, a comedy entitled Our American Cousin, with which Booth was familiar, at one of Washington's nicest theaters, Ford's Theater, with which Booth was also very well acquainted. He had performed there in the past, and he knew the layout of the place very well. So this is an ideal opportunity for Booth, and he moves very quickly to set his plan into action. What Booth decides is he gathers a small group of supporters, and he decides to sort of activate them on that day. Booth, of course, would take the main mission of killing Lincoln. He ordered Lewis Powell to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward, who was recovering at home from a carriage accident. Rather more serious injury than the one I have suffered. He ordered George Atzerodt to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was staying at a hotel in Washington. The three of them would meet with a fourth conspirator, David Harold, who was supposed to help Powell escape. All four of them would meet up in southeastern Maryland, where their contacts in the Confederate underground there would help them flee back to Virginia. As it turned out, only Booth was successful. I've emphasized that he was working with other people, but he didn't make very good choices about who he worked with. Powell only managed to injure the Secretary of State. He stabbed him, but he got into a fight with other members of the Secretary of State's household and had to flee. So he doesn't succeed in killing the Secretary of State. Atzerodt spent a lot of that evening drinking some liquid courage, but he never got up enough courage to kill the Vice President, and he never even tried. So only Booth is able to really carry out the plan. He snuck into the theater through the back. He actually walked under the stage. There's a passageway under the stage, so he's down there while the play is being performed. He crosses under the stage. He actually leaves the theater again, stops off at a nearby tavern to fortify himself with some liquid courage. He comes back into the theater through the front door, goes up the steps to the presidential box, braced the door to the box shut behind him so it was difficult to open, crept close to Lincoln's chair, leveled a small pistol, and fired one shot, which tore into the back of Booth's head and lodged behind his eye. After stabbing the young Army officer who had accompanied the President and Mrs. Lincoln to the play, Booth leapt to the stage below, breaking his leg in the process, but he still was never one to miss a theatrical flourish. And even with his broken legs, Booth raised both arms and shouts the state motto of Virginia, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, and fled into the night. Now doctors converged very quickly to try to help the president. They agreed that he would probably not survive a return trip to the White House. He was wounded too badly. So they sought sanctuary in a nearby boarding house right across the street from Ford's Theater, owned by a man named William Peterson. They recruit the help of some soldiers who happened to be in the audience to carry the president to the Peterson house. And this is where our first West Virginian comes into the play. If you look at the sheet in front of you, one of these soldiers is Private William McPeck of Morgantown, West Virginia. McPeck had enlisted in the 3rd West Virginia Infantry early in the war, but he stayed on when it was reorganized as the 6th West Virginia Cavalry. And he just happened to be stationed on guard duty in Washington, D.C. that night, and he was the one who happened to be stationed right outside the Ford's Theater. So McPeck is there. He's one of 6 men. A lot more than 6 claimed to have carried the president, but we know who they were, and McPeck was one. He is there to help carry Lincoln across the street to the Peterson house. They lay him very awkwardly in a bed that's much too short for the president. They have to lay him sideways in the bed and curl his legs under him. Later on, McPeck would, of course, far outlive the president. He lived until 1921. He's buried at Pleasant Grove Cemetery in Preston County. And on his grave marker, it mentions that he's one of those who had helped the mortally wounded Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, only has hours to live. His doctors did the best that they could. They recognized that it's probably only a matter of time. And by 7:22 the next morning, Lincoln was dead. Now, Lincoln's death ended the first act of this drama, but the second act was just beginning. And it's during this time that people across the country are trying to figure out just how deep and just how wide the conspiracy against Lincoln was. They don't have any idea about who might be behind this or about how deeply into the Confederate government this plan might have ranged. So there's this second stage in the history of the assassination that really doesn't end until July 7th, 1865, several months later, when when four of Booth's co-conspirators are hanged. So there's several months there where Americans are struggling to understand the plot, and at the same time, they're also trying to begin to rebuild the country. And so keep that in mind when we come back and we look at what's going on within West Virginia. Attention fixes on Booth, because he's well known and because he's the one who fired the fatal shot. But everybody knew that he had an actual weapon. So it's a time of really wild rumors. Booth remains at large for 12 days after the assassination. And eyewitnesses swear that they see him all over the place. He's kind of like the Elvis of the day. They say they see him in Detroit and in Philadelphia and in St. Louis and all over. Eventually, Booth and David Harold end up getting cornered in northeastern Virginia, where they had fled with the assistance of Confederate agents and paroled Confederate soldiers. They are confronted by federal detectives and Union cavalrymen, and they are caught at a tobacco barn owned by one Richard Garrett in northeastern Virginia. A detachment of soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry are there. They're led by an intelligence agent named Everton Conger, who is our second West Virginia connection. We're not sure where Conger was born. He may have been born in Ohio, or he may have been born in what became West Virginia. We know he was born in 1834, and we know that he'd been a dentist before the war. And if you really look at his face, that's not the face I want to see in the chair, because I'm in the dentist office. Anxiety enough. But in any case, Conger enlists in the 3rd West Virginia Cavalry in December of 1861. He rises through the ranks very quickly. He's kind of a natural leader. He rises to the rank of captain before being badly wounded in combat. But after he recovers from his wounds, he actually gets recruited into an intelligence agency that operates in Washington, D.C., run by a guy named Lafayette Baker. And it is Baker who assigns Conger the very important task of leading the detachment of soldiers who are sent after Booth as soon after the assassination as they can. Now Conger has caught his man. David Harold gave himself up, so he surrenders peacefully. Booth refuses to surrender. Conger sets the barn on fire, to flush him out. But before Booth could shoot his way out, Sergeant Boston Corbett, and there's all kinds of stories about him if you want to ask about him during the question and answer. Corbett shoots Booth through the neck. Booth's carried from the barn, mortally wounded, placed on the front porch of the Garrett homestead, where he died. Conger is there on hand to hear Booth's final words, "Tell my mother I died for my country." Conger received $15,000 for his role in the capture of Booth and of his co-conspirator. After the war, Conger kept moving. He moved westward. He moved to Illinois, then he moved to Montana Territory, and then he actually moved to Hawaii, where he died in 1918. As it turned out, though, Booth and Harold were among the last of the co-conspirators to be caught. Ultimately, the government would identify 10 people in the conspiracy. One of them, John Surratt Jr., was not captured for several years and was never convicted of any crime. Booth never stood trial, of course. But the other 8 who were caught between April 17th and April 26th, their capture set the stage for a dramatic trial that remains controversial to this day. People still have very strong feelings about what happened in the trial of these people accused of collaborating with Booth. Some people looked at the evidence that's uncovered during that trial, and they see evidence that a conspiracy extending way deep into the Confederate government, perhaps all the way up to Jefferson Davis himself, was behind the assassination. Other people view the trial as a terrible miscarriage of justice, in part because it was carried out before a military tribunal as opposed to a civilian court. In the end, all 8 of the defendants were convicted. Several of them received prison terms, 4 of them did, The other 4 were sentenced to death. This is Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and perhaps most controversially of all, Mary Surratt, who was the first woman executed by the U.S. government. They were all killed on July 7th. Now, because of our emphasis, because of our location, I want to focus on one of the 9 men who sat in judgment of Booth's alleged co-conspirators. So he's one of the 9 military officers who are presiding over the court in which these people are tried. And this is Thomas M. Harris, a physician from Ritchie County, who is the 3rd West Virginian on your sheet. He began his wartime service as colonel of the 10th West Virginia Infantry. He fought, he rose in the ranks, he rises to division command. His soldiers are actually some of those at Appomattox who cut off Lee's last escape there before the surrender. And it is Harris who is appointed to be on this military tribunal. He'd been a medical doctor, of course. He didn't have any formal legal training. But he's there, he hears testimony from 366 witnesses, and he and the other commissioners delivered their verdicts on June 30th. They voted separately on each case, each of the 8 cases. A simple majority was needed to convict. A supermajority of 2/3 was needed for the death sentence. And what's interesting is that the way that the tribunal seems to have thought about the execution of Mary Surratt in particular, her execution seems to have weighed very heavily on their consciences, because 5 out of the 9 signed a special recommendation asking President Andrew Johnson to grant Surratt executive clemency, to reduce her sentence. And this is a very strange thing for them to do, because on the one hand, they are convinced enough of her guilt, and convinced enough of her guilt of a capital crime, to vote to execute her, and then they ask the president to step in and use his power to grant her a clemency for the execution. Harris is not one of those 5. Harris takes the harder line on this, and he believes that they have convicted her of a capital crime and that she ought to pay that price. In the end, it didn't matter for Surratt. She's executed. Johnson did not grant this clemency. He later claimed that he never received the request. And this is just a matter of who do you believe? Do you believe Johnson, or do you believe the guy who said he delivered this request to him? But it made no difference to Surratt, who's hanged with the other 3 on July 7th. Now, in many ways, this is the peak of Harris's career. He returned to civilian life. He continued to practice medicine. He served for a spell in the West Virginia State Legislature. After he retired, he turned to use his final years to write about the assassination. By the 1890s, there's a very strong sense among a lot of people involved in the war that their generation is passing on, and that a new generation is rising that doesn't really remember the war. And so they want to work very hard to make sure that their recollection of events is the one that passed along. So Harris publishes 2 books about the trial and about the assassination. He offers a very passionate defense of the execution of Mary Surratt and a kind of overview of the evidence. His first book is partisan but not irrational, published in 1892. His second book is where Harris really kind of goes off the deep end. He publishes a book called Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And in it, he places the entire responsibility for Lincoln's murder on the Catholic Church. On very high levels of the Catholic Church, who he believes are still seeking to conquer the United States in the 1890s, and they have been the ones to order that Lincoln be removed. Now, of course, Harris is not alone in crafting conspiracy theories. There have been theories of all kinds about the Lincoln assassination. The Catholic conspiracy actually came back in the early 1960s, and if you think about who was president then, that might tell you why. But for Harris, I think we can read this as a kind of act of self-defense. He was outraged by claims that they had ordered Surratt's execution only because she was Catholic. In other words, they had accused these commissioners of being prejudiced against her. And he responds to these charges by crafting this very wild conspiracy theory, taking this kind of anti-Catholic hostility to more extreme heights. So this is kind of a sad end to Harris's career, a regrettable end to an otherwise honorable career. But as of July 7th, justice, according to Harris, has been served. And so from a national perspective, this 3 months of assassination and manhunt and trial and execution seem to have come to an end. But if